China has been actively fighting desertification on its land, a phrase many have probably heard by now. According to official data, from 2016 to 2020, the country turned about 21.7 million acres of desertified land into green areas. That means, on average, China transformed around 4.3 million acres per year. Of course, the Chinese didn't stop there. In 2022, they planted another 9.3 million acres of forest, and in 2023, China went even further, more than 9.8 million acres of degraded land got covered with trees. Sounds incredible, because every year the Chinese plant an insane number of trees. They're fighting hard to stop the desert from spreading. But it's not that simple. Many experts say that the greening program isn't exactly effective, and if deserts keep expanding, China will have to plant trees for another 100 years or more. But China wouldn't be China if it didn't come up with a brilliant solution, and we're about to find out what that is. Some experts say that over time, 85% of all plants planted in barren soil just die. And we're not talking about just any experts here, these are scientists from Beijing Forestry University, so you can trust the info. Trees are great and all, but the thing is, sand can move. All those billions of tons of tiny particles spread across the desert aren't really held in place by anything. That's why the Chinese are planting a huge number of trees. Thanks to their roots, the sand stops moving and the desert keeps shrinking instead of spreading. However, a lot of plants just can't handle growing in shifting sands. The grains keep blowing away, leaving the roots exposed. And once the most vulnerable part of the plant is completely out in the open, it's only a matter of time before it dies. Just imagine how tough things get on the outskirts of the desert, where planting is at least somewhat feasible. About 80% of the desert is shifting dunes, which, according to UNESCO, move around 65 feet per year. In such conditions, no plant can survive. Its roots will either get exposed, or the sapling will eventually end up buried under a thick layer of sand. Either way, that's not exactly great for its future growth. Plus, there's no wind protection in deserts, so it can reach pretty high speeds. That's exactly why the sand keeps moving. But besides shifting sand, the wind itself is a problem for plants. Strong gusts can damage their parts, which isn't great for their growth either. Many plants that are planted in sandy areas still need at least some nutrients to grow. But sand dunes and arid places often don't have much to offer, which is why the building blocks of China's green walls just wither and die. This planting takes place in China every year on March 12th. It's a very important date for the country, the tree planting day, when lots of ordinary people head out to drylands to put a new plant into the ground. On this day, everyone who steps outside knows that if they're between 11 and 60 years old, they have to plant 3 to 5 trees each year or do some equivalent work related to growing plants. And get this, tree planting in China is such a big deal that many couples get married the day before the holiday just so they can celebrate their wedding with a freshly planted tree. Yes, all of this is just wonderful. The population actively participates in saving the country from desertification, so actively, in fact, that various estimates suggest around 50 billion trees have been planted in recent years. This practice works great in places where trees and shrubs can grow reasonably well. But when it comes to sand, that requires some specific knowledge, where, how, and what to plant so that it doesn't end up dying. And it's also useful to know what can be done to increase the plant survival rates. People in China who really know their stuff are using a legal cheat for planting in desert conditions, straw. The idea is simply brilliant. But what exactly is meant by straw in this case? When wheat, oats, rice, and a few other similar crops ripen, they develop two parts, the ears, that's the stuff on top, and everything else, including the leaves and stems. When the time has come to gather the harvest, the combines drive onto the field. They separate the ears from the rest. The former go on to make well-known products like bread if we're talking about wheat. The rest, meaning everything else, usually stays in the field and dries out. That's how straw is created, which is then used, for example, as animal feed. In short, it's the dead, dried-up plants. The Chinese have a lot of this straw. Everyone knows that China is a rice country, right? So, as of 2024, there were more than 74 million acres of rice fields, which produced over 207 million tons of rice. There's no exact data on how much straw China gathered that year, but according to the International Rice Research Institute, the ratio is roughly, so we can say that in 2024 the country harvested over 200 million tons of straw just from rice. If we talk about the total amount of straw without focusing just on the country's main crop, China collects about 1 billion tons of this resource every year. As you might have guessed, the production leftovers aren't thrown away. Everything that wasn't used for animal feed and other purposes can definitely be put to some other use, for example, to fight deserts. In this case, the straw is placed on sand dunes, just on the sand or other dry areas, in these kinds of grids. On a large scale, it turns into kind of a huge checkerboard made up of hundreds or thousands of cells. Setting up this whole system is definitely not an easy task and far from cheap as it might seem at first. First of all, you need to bring all this mass to the desert area, that's costly. Plus, sometimes getting to places with sand can be quite tricky. Secondly, such a system needs to be created properly. First, you dig trenches. Then you place straw in them. It may seem like it's not that hard, but once again we remind you that this is often done in the desert where there's no rain to cool things off. The temperatures are high, and finding shade to rest is like finding a needle in a haystack. But still, there are tons of Chinese workers who lay down straw because the downsides of setting up such a system fade when you see the final result. For example, these straw cells are a great way to get nutrients for plants. First, straw checkerboards are laid out on the dunes and other dry areas. Then seeds of plants that are resistant to the local conditions, like some shrubs or suitable trees, are placed into each cell. The wind lifts these seeds and spreads them to the inner edges of the straw barriers, which decompose and become a kind of natural fertilizer. Each straw cell will break down over 3 years, after which living grass checkerboard barriers will appear, turning the dunes green. Even a bit of fertility for plants in harsh desert conditions sounds pretty good. But the scientists studying straw cells have discovered another useful effect. Each straw line increases the dune's ability to trap dust, which leads to the accumulation of organic matter and nutrients on the dune's surface. Scientists even pointed to the evidence where straw cells were used. They found noticeable differences in plant species diversity, grass cover, and the physical and chemical properties of the soil. So the cells are not a magical solution that turns sand dunes into perfect green meadows, but they do a great job of giving plants a better chance of survival in tough conditions. On top of that, there's another positive effect. Straw cells act as a kind of barrier. It limits the movement of sand, which constantly tries to escape and expose the roots of trees and bushes, or bury them. The saplings are safe in the straw surrounding because the sand they're planted in becomes more stable. As researchers have found out, thanks to the straw checkerboards, the intensity of the sand flow drops by 99.5%, meaning it becomes almost completely still. And this, of course, seriously increases the survival rate of plants in the harsh desert dunes.